the reaction so significant. People weren't just debating the past anymore. They were debating possibilities. Possibilities are powerful. In fact, they're often more powerful than facts. Because facts describe what happened, possibilities describe what could happen. And humans are naturally fascinated by what could happen. That's why speculation spreads so quickly, especially when it involves royalty, especially when it involves power, especially when it involves family conflict. Now here's where things become interesting. Many royal commentators argue that William has gained something incredibly valuable over the last few years. Not popularity, not influence, not authority. Distance. Distance from the controversy itself. Think about it. While Harry and Meghan continued appearing in headlines, William often remained focused on public duties. Charity work, environmental initiatives, official appearances, family events, the monarchy. Whether intentional or not, that created a very different public image. One image focused on conflict, another image focused on continuity. And according to some analysts, audiences began noticing that contrast. At first, the difference didn't seem important. But over time, it became more noticeable. Then more noticeable. Then impossible to ignore. That's when some commentators started asking a question that would have sounded ridiculous just a few years ago. What if William's greatest advantage was simply saying less? It's a controversial theory, but it's one that has gained attention. Because silence creates mystery, and mystery creates curiosity. People naturally want to know what isn't being said, what isn't being revealed, what remains hidden. That's human nature. The less information available, the harder people search for clues. And according to some royal watchers, that's exactly what happened. Every public appearance became analysed. Every interview became analysed. Every speech became analysed. People weren't just listening to what William said. They were paying attention to what he didn't say. That's where the speculation exploded, because many commentators began interpreting William's silence as strategy. Not emotional strategy. Institutional strategy. The strategy of someone preparing for a future role. Again, nobody outside William's inner circle knows if that's true, but the perception itself became powerful. Powerful enough to influence the broader conversation. And once perceptions start changing, reactions follow. That's exactly what stunned many observers, because public reactions started becoming less predictable. People who once supported Harry unconditionally began asking harder questions. People who once criticized William began reconsidering certain assumptions. People who had ignored royal news entirely suddenly became interested again. The audience was changing. The conversation was changing. The atmosphere was changing. And according to some commentators, change creates uncertainty. Uncertainty creates anxiety, especially for public figures. Because uncertainty is difficult to manage, you can't fight uncertainty directly. You can't issue a statement and eliminate it. You can't hold an interview and make it disappear. It lingers, growing quietly, expanding gradually, until eventually everyone feels it. That's where many analysts believe the current story sits. In a period of transition, not a conclusion, not a climax, a transition. The old narrative is weakening. The new narrative hasn't fully formed. And whenever that happens, strange things occur. Unexpected alliances emerge. Unexpected questions gain attention. Unexpected voices become influential. That's why discussions involving Diana's family attracted so much attention. Not necessarily because of what was said, but because they arrived at a moment when people were already questioning everything. Timing matters. Sometimes timing matters more than content. The same comment made 5 years earlier might have been ignored. Today it becomes a headline. That's the power of context. And context is exactly what makes this story so explosive. Because for the first time in years, many observers believe the public is looking beyond the feud itself. Looking beyond the interviews. Looking beyond the documentaries. Looking beyond the accusations. They're looking toward the future. And according to some royal commentators, that future may be where the biggest surprises are waiting. Because eventually speculation reaches a limit. Eventually people stop asking what might happen. and start discovering what actually happens. That's when stories change forever. That's when narratives are tested. That's when assumptions face reality. And according to many analysts, that moment may be getting closer. Not because anyone has special information, not because secret plans have been confirmed, but because time never stops moving. And time changes everything. The monarchy changes, public opinion changes, media attention changes, people change. Nothing stays frozen forever. Which brings us to the biggest question of all. What happens when the future finally arrives? What happens when years of speculation collide with reality? What happens when William's role grows larger than ever before? And what happens if the public discovers that the story they've been following for years was only part of a much larger picture? Because, according to some royal watchers, the answer to those questions may determine how this entire royal era is remembered. And that's exactly where our final chapter begins. After years of headlines, years of speculation, years of accusations, interviews, documentaries, books, and endless debate, we arrive at the question that has kept millions of people glued to this story from the very beginning. What if the biggest twist hasn't happened yet? Because according to many royal commentators, the most important moments in royal history rarely arrive when everyone expects them. They arrive quietly, without warning, without leaks, without dramatic announcements. And then suddenly the entire landscape changes. That's why so many royal observers believe we're approaching a defining moment. Not because a major decision has already been made. Not because a shocking revelation has already emerged, but because all the pieces appear to be moving into place at the same time. Think about everything that's happened. The interviews, the memoir, the documentaries, the public disputes, the family tension, the endless media attention. For years, those events dominated the conversation. But now, the conversation feels different, because people aren't focused on the conflict itself anymore. They're focused on the outcome. And outcomes change everything. For a long time, the royal story was driven by revelations. Every few months, a new claim would appear, a new allegation, a new headline, a new controversy. The public became conditioned to expect another chapter, another bombshell, another round of drama. But eventually, every story reaches a point where new revelations matter less than future consequences. That's exactly where many analysts believe this story is heading, because regardless of who people support, one reality remains unavoidable. Time is moving forward, and time changes everything. Harry's role is changing, Meghan's role is changing, William's role is changing. The monarchy itself is changing. Nothing remains static forever. That's why some royal commentators believe the next phase of this story will be completely different from the last phase. Not louder, more important. Because the future is where speculation becomes reality. The future is where theories are tested. The future is where people discover whether they were right all along, or completely wrong. Now here's the fascinating part. Throughout this entire saga, people have often treated Harry and William as opposing forces. Two brothers, two perspectives, two competing narratives. But according to some royal observers, that framing may have oversimplified the situation. Because beneath all the headlines lies something much deeper. Legacy. The legacy of Diana. The legacy of the monarchy. The legacy each brother hopes to leave behind. And legacy is powerful. Far more powerful than a single interview. Far more powerful than a temporary controversy. Because when history looks back, it rarely remembers every argument. It remembers outcomes. It remembers decisions. It remembers consequences. That's why many commentators believe the next few years may ultimately determine how this entire era is remembered. Not the interviews, not the documentaries, not the accusations, the results. What happened afterward, what changed, what endured. And according to some analysts, that's where Harry faces his greatest challenge. Not criticism, not public scrutiny, not even controversy. The challenge of defining his future independently from his past. Because for years Harry's story has been connected to the royal family, connected to Diana, connected to William, connected to the institution. The question now is whether a completely new chapter can emerge. a chapter that stands on its own. Supporters believe absolutely yes. Critics remain skeptical. The debate continues, but the question itself has become increasingly important. At the same time, William faces a different challenge, the challenge of expectations. Because the closer someone gets to the throne, the greater the expectations become. People project hopes onto future kings. They project fears, predictions, assumptions, expectations, sometimes unrealistic expectations. That's exactly what's happening now. Commentators constantly speculate about what William might do, what kind of king he might become, what priorities he might have, how he might handle family tensions. The truth is that nobody knows, not yet, and that's why the speculation remains so intense. Because uncertainty creates curiosity, curiosity creates attention, attention creates headlines, and headlines keep the story alive. Now let's return to the question that started this entire video. The so-called biggest secret. What if the secret was never about Meghan at all? What if the secret was public perception? Because throughout this entire controversy, one thing has become increasingly clear. Different people are watching completely different stories. Supporters see one narrative, critics see another. Neutral observers see something entirely different. And that may be the biggest revelation of all. Not that someone was hiding a secret, but that millions of people interpreted the same events in completely different ways. That's why this story has survived for so long, because there was never one version of events. There were many versions, competing versions, conflicting versions, versions shaped by personal beliefs, experiences, loyalties, and emotions. And as long as those competing narratives exist, the debate continues. That's why royal commentators remain fascinated. Because this story isn't really about who wins. It's about how history remembers everyone involved. Harry, Meghan, William, the monarchy, Diana's legacy, all of it. And history rarely delivers its verdict immediately. History takes time. Years sometimes. Decades sometimes. Only then does the larger picture become clear. Which means the real ending to this story may still be years away. But according to many royal watchers, one thing is already obvious. The next chapter will be bigger than the last. Because for the first time in years, the conversation isn't about what happened. It's about what happens next. And that question remains unanswered. For now. But not forever. Because eventually every mystery reaches its conclusion. Every debate reaches its verdict. Every story reaches its final chapter. The only question is whether that final chapter will look anything like the story people think they're watching today. And according to many royal observers, that's where the real shock may be waiting. What do you think about this entire situation? Do you believe Prince William saw things differently from the very beginning? Or do you think the media is creating a narrative that simply doesn't exist? And when history finally looks back on this royal era, who do you think will be proven right? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because this debate is far from over, and some of the biggest questions still remain unanswered. If you enjoyed this deep dive analysis, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next royal update, breakdown, or exclusive analysis. See you in the next video. What if the biggest secret in the entire royal saga wasn't hidden inside a palace, but hidden in plain sight? For years, Prince Harry has defended Meghan Markle against critics, media attacks, and royal commentators. Through interviews, documentaries, podcasts, and even his best-selling memoir, Harry made one thing absolutely clear. He believed Meghan was being misunderstood. But according to growing speculation among royal watchers, a shocking new discussion has reignited one of the most controversial questions in royal history. What if William saw something Harry didn't? What if the future king recognized a pattern long before anyone else noticed it? And what if that pattern is connected to a secret that could completely change how the public views Meghan Markle? Royal commentators are now debating a series of claims that have exploded across social media, triggering fierce arguments among supporters and critics alike. Some believe it's all exaggerated gossip. Others believe this could be the beginning of a major turning point. But here's where things become truly fascinating. Because according to several royal observers, Harry may have found himself facing a reality he never expected. A reality involving loyalty, perception, and a revelation that nobody saw coming. And if those theories are even partially true, this story could become one of the most dramatic royal controversies of the year. For years, public attention focused on one central question. Why did Harry and Meghan leave royal life? The world became obsessed with finding answers. Every interview generated headlines. Every documentary created new debates. Every book release sparked fresh controversy. Supporters argued that Harry and Meghan were simply trying to build a healthier life away from constant pressure. Critics believed the couple unfairly attacked the institution that had supported them. Neither side backed down, and over time, the disagreement grew larger than anyone imagined. But according to some royal commentators, the biggest story wasn't what Harry and Meghan were saying. It was what William wasn't saying. Because while Harry spent years explaining his decisions publicly, William largely remained silent. That silence became one of the most discussed aspects of the entire feud. Why wasn't William responding? Why wasn't he defending himself? Why wasn't he publicly challenging the claims being made? At first, many people assumed the answer was simple. Royal protocol. Future kings are expected to remain above public arguments. Future kings avoid emotional media battles. Future kings focus on the institution. But according to some royal analysts, there may have been another reason. Patience. The belief that time eventually reveals things that arguments never can. Now, to be clear, there is no evidence that William publicly accused Meghan of hiding any secret. However, many commentators believe he may have viewed the situation very differently than Harry did from the beginning. Because while Harry saw a love story under attack, some critics claim William saw warning signs. Small warning signs at first. Nothing dramatic, nothing headline-worthy, just observations, questions, concerns. According to royal biographers, William reportedly worried about how quickly the relationship developed and whether Harry was moving too fast. Those accounts come from commentators and authors, not official confirmation from William himself. At the time, Harry reportedly interpreted those concerns as a lack of support. But years later, some royal watchers began revisiting those reports with fresh eyes. And that's where the controversy started, because people began asking, what exactly was William worried about? Was it simply brotherly concern, or was it something more? The truth is that nobody outside the family knows for certain. But uncertainty creates speculation, and speculation creates stories. That's exactly what happened. Over time, royal commentators began developing competing theories. Some believed William was trying to protect Harry. Others believed he was trying to protect the monarchy. Others argued both things could be true simultaneously. Regardless of which theory people supported, one fact remained. The relationship between the brothers continued deteriorating, and with every passing year, the divide became more visible. Interviews widened the gap, books widened the gap, public accusations widened the gap. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of focusing on the feud itself, people started looking backward, examining old events, revisiting old reports, comparing old statements with newer developments, searching for patterns, searching for clues, searching for answers. And according to some commentators, that's when the phrase, "William knew all along," began appearing in discussions. Not because any secret had been confirmed, but because hindsight changes how people interpret history. Events that once seemed ordinary suddenly appear significant. Comments that once seemed harmless suddenly appear meaningful. And relationships that once seemed straightforward suddenly look far more complicated. That's what makes this story so fascinating. Because the alleged secret isn't necessarily a secret at all. It may simply be a difference in perception. A difference in how two brothers viewed the same situation. Harry saw one reality. William may have seen another. And according to some royal observers, that difference in perception may have changed the course of royal history itself. But if William truly believed something was wrong from the beginning, then why didn't he stop it? And more importantly, What exactly did he think Harry was missing? If part 1 was about the concerns some royal commentators believe William may have had from the very beginning, then part 2 is about something even more controversial: the pattern. Because according to many royal observers, major royal controversies rarely explode because of one event. They grow, slowly, quietly, one incident at a time, one disagreement at a time, one misunderstanding at a time, until eventually people stop looking at individual moments and start looking at the bigger picture. And according to some analysts, that's exactly what happened here. For years, every major headline involving Harry and Meghan seemed isolated. An interview here, a disagreement there, a documentary, a podcast, a memoir, a public appearance. Each event created its own controversy, its own debate, its own cycle of media coverage. But over time, royal commentators began connecting those events together, not as separate stories, but as chapters in the same story. And once that happened, new questions started appearing. Questions that nobody had been asking before. Questions like, why did so many relationships inside the royal family reportedly become strained? Why did tensions continue escalating instead of improving? Why did reconciliation attempts seem to struggle? And perhaps most importantly, why did William reportedly become more distant instead of more understanding? Those questions became impossible to ignore, because according to several royal commentators, William's behaviour followed a remarkably consistent pattern. He didn't publicly attack Harry. He didn't launch media campaigns. He didn't give explosive interviews. Instead, he appeared to do something far more frustrating. He stepped back, and according to some analysts, that decision may have spoken louder than any statement ever could. Because distance sends a message. Silence sends a message. Absence sends a message, especially inside families. Now, supporters of Harry and Meghan often argue that William's distance reflected institutional loyalty rather than personal judgment. Critics disagree. They believe William had already formed conclusions years earlier. Again, these are interpretations, not proven facts. But the debate itself has become a major part of the royal narrative. And that's where the idea of a secret started evolving. Because according to some royal watchers, the secret isn't a hidden document. It isn't a leaked recording. It isn't a shocking revelation locked inside palace walls. The secret is perception. Specifically, how different people perceived Meghan from the beginning. Think about it. Harry often described Meghan as someone who was unfairly misunderstood. Someone who entered an impossible situation. Someone forced to deal with extraordinary pressure. That perspective became central to Harry's public story, and millions of people accepted it. Many still do. But according to critics, William may have viewed things through a completely different lens. Not necessarily because he disliked Meghan, not necessarily because he opposed the relationship, but because he interpreted events differently. That's the key distinction. Interpretation. Because two people can witness the exact same situation and reach completely different conclusions. One sees loyalty, another sees strategy, one sees sincerity, another sees ambition, one sees misunderstanding, another sees manipulation. Same events, different interpretations. That's what makes this story so complicated. Nobody can prove what William truly believed. Nobody can prove what Harry truly believed. Yet the consequences of those beliefs shaped everything that followed. And according to some commentators, that's where the alleged pattern becomes important. Because when royal watchers look back over the last several years, they often point to the same observation. William's concerns reportedly appeared before most public controversies occurred. Before the interviews, before the documentaries, before the books, before the public accusations. That timing matters because it fuels a controversial theory. What if William wasn't reacting to later events? What if he expected them? Again, there is no evidence proving that claim. But the theory continues spreading because it creates a compelling narrative. A narrative where William saw warning signs early. A narrative where Harry dismissed those concerns. A narrative where later events appeared to confirm William's fears. Whether that narrative is accurate is impossible to know. Yet many commentators continue discussing it. Because hindsight is powerful. When people look backward, they often reinterpret events differently. What seemed insignificant at the time suddenly appears meaningful. What seemed ordinary suddenly appears suspicious. And what seemed like coincidence suddenly appears intentional. That's exactly what's happening now. Years after the original disagreements, royal commentators are revisiting old stories with completely different assumptions. They're asking whether the clues were always there, whether the signs were always visible, whether Harry simply chose not to see them. And according to some analysts, that's why this story resonates so strongly with audiences. Because it's not really about royalty. It's about something universal. Trust. Everyone understands trust. Everyone understands loyalty. Everyone understands the fear of discovering that someone else may have seen something you didn't. That's why people connect emotionally to this story. Not because of royal titles, not because of palace politics, but because the underlying themes feel familiar. Family disagreements, conflicting perspectives, warnings ignored, relationships tested. Those experiences exist far beyond royal life. And that's exactly why millions of people continue following the story.
There is the whistle under.
They're not just watching princess.
Product is still there rotting away. And you'll note, Lady C, this claim that all of that product, which literally has expiration dates, was...
Some royal observers, the real turning point wasn't when Harry left the royal family. It wasn't when the interviews aired. It wasn't when the memoir was published. The real turning point came when public opinion started fragmenting, because for years people largely chose one side or the other. But now, many observers occupy the middle ground, questioning both narratives, questioning both perspectives, questioning everything. And that uncertainty creates a completely different environment. An environment where old assumptions are constantly challenged, where new interpretations emerge, and where long-standing narratives suddenly become vulnerable. That's why some commentators believe Harry faces a challenge he never anticipated. Not opposition, not criticism, but doubt, public doubt. And public doubt is difficult to overcome because it doesn't require evidence. It only requires questions, questions that linger, questions that grow, questions that refuse to disappear. Which brings us to the biggest question of all. What happens if the public begins believing William's version of events, even though William has never fully shared it? Because if that happens, everything changes. And according to some royal watchers, that's exactly the possibility making this story more explosive than ever before. For years, the battle seemed straightforward. Two competing narratives, two competing sides, two competing versions of the same story. Supporters of Harry and Meghan believed they had been treated unfairly. Critics believed the couple had unfairly criticized the royal family. The lines were clear. The arguments were familiar, and the public largely fell into one camp or the other. But according to many royal commentators, something changed. Not overnight, not because of one interview, not because of one headline, but because of time. Time has a strange effect on public controversies. At first, people focus on emotion. They react immediately. They choose sides. They defend their positions. But as years pass, emotions cool. People begin revisiting old events, re-examining old claims, questioning old assumptions. And that's exactly what some analysts believe happened here. The audience matured. The story matured. And suddenly people weren't asking the same questions anymore. Instead of asking, who's right? They started asking, what actually happened? That shift may sound small, but according to royal observers, it changed everything. Because once people start searching for answers instead of validation, the conversation becomes far less predictable. Suddenly, supporters become skeptical, critics become curious, neutral observers become engaged, and public opinion starts fragmenting. That's exactly what many commentators claim happened. For years, Harry's perspective dominated many headlines. His interviews generated global attention. His memoir became a bestseller. His documentaries attracted millions of viewers. The world listened. But according to some analysts, eventually a new question emerged. What comes after the story is told, because once someone explains their side, the audience naturally wants something else. Evidence, results, resolution, closure. And that's where things became difficult, because closure never arrived. The feud continued, the disagreements continued, the speculation continued, the headlines continued. And after a while, some observers began feeling like the story was moving in circles. That's when commentators suggested something interesting. The audience was becoming less interested in accusations, and more interested in outcomes, less interested in blame, and more interested in consequences, less interested in the past, and more interested in the future. That evolution changed the entire conversation, because future-focused discussions inevitably lead back to one person, Prince William. Not because William was dominating headlines, not because William was making dramatic statements, but because William represents the future of the institution itself. And according to many royal analysts, that reality gave him a unique advantage. While Harry continued explaining the past, William increasingly became associated with the future. That's a powerful position, because people are naturally drawn toward what's coming next, not what already happened. The future creates curiosity. The future creates anticipation. The future creates suspense. And suspense keeps audiences engaged. That's why some commentators believe the center of gravity gradually shifted. Not away from Harry entirely, but toward questions Harry couldn't answer. Questions only time could answer. Questions only future events could answer. For example, what kind of king will William become? How will the monarchy evolve? Will relationships ever be repaired? Will tensions eventually fade? Nobody knows. And because nobody knows, people keep watching. Now here's where the situation becomes especially complicated for Harry. For years, he operated from a position of revelation. He was revealing stories, revealing experiences, revealing perspectives. But eventually there are fewer revelations left to make. At some point, the audience stops asking, "What happened?" and starts asking, "What happens next?" That's a completely different conversation. And according to some royal observers, Harry wasn't prepared for how quickly that shift would occur. Not because he made mistakes, not because he miscalculated, but because public attention is unpredictable. One year, audiences want explanations. The next year, they want outcomes. One year, they want conflict. The next year, they want resolution. The rules constantly change, and public figures rarely control those changes. The audience does. That's why some analysts believe Harry faces a challenge unlike any he's faced before. The challenge of relevance in a changing narrative. Not personal relevance, narrative relevance. Because stories evolve. And when stories evolve, characters sometimes find themselves playing different roles than they expected. For years, Harry was the central figure. Now, increasingly, discussions focus on William's future reign, William's future decisions, William's future priorities. Whether fair or unfair, that's where much of the attention is heading. And, according to commentators, that reality may explain why recent debates have felt different. Less emotional, more analytical, less reactive, more speculative. People are no longer arguing only about what happened. They're predicting what happens next. And prediction creates a completely different kind of pressure. Because predictions invite uncertainty. Uncertainty invites doubt. And doubt invites scrutiny. That's exactly why some royal believe Harry is entering the most challenging phase of the entire story. Not because opposition has increased, but because certainty has decreased. People are less confident, less sure, less willing to accept simple explanations. They're asking harder questions, demanding more context, seeking more nuance. And that environment is difficult for everyone involved. Harry, Meghan, William, the media, the commentators, everyone. Because once public opinion becomes fragmented, nobody controls the narrative anymore. The narrative controls itself. It evolves independently, driven by millions of conversations happening simultaneously. That's the environment we're seeing today. An environment where certainty is rare, where assumptions are challenged, where old narratives face new questions. And according to some analysts, That's exactly why this controversy refuses to disappear. Because the story is no longer about the past.
Based on one that wants to be out of
The future remains unwritten. But if public opinion is truly shifting, if audiences are genuinely re-evaluating everything, then the biggest surprise may still be ahead. Because according to some royal commentators, the next chapter isn't about Harry, and it isn't about Meghan. It's about the reaction that could change how this entire royal era is remembered. And that's exactly where we're going next. If part 3 was about shifting public opinion, then part 4 is about what happened after that shift became impossible to ignore. Because according to many royal commentators, there comes a moment in every major public controversy when the conversation takes on a life of its own. No single person controls it. No interview can stop it. No statement can redirect it. The story becomes bigger than the people inside it. And some analysts believe that's exactly what's happening now. For years, Harry and Meghan were the center of the discussion. Every headline revolved around them. Every debate revolved around them. Every major royal controversy seemed connected to them in some way. But recently, something unexpected started happening. The spotlight began moving. Not completely, not dramatically, but noticeably. And according to royal observers, that shift caught many people by surprise. Because attention wasn't simply moving away from Harry and Meghan. It was moving toward the future, toward William, toward the monarchy's next chapter, toward questions that nobody can answer yet. That's what made the reaction so significant. People weren't just debating the past.
This scandal comes as no surprise. Speculation about the children has been simmering for years.
the whole description she does of the Portland hospital.
Possibilities to describe what could happen. And humans are naturally fascinated by what could happen. That's why speculation spreads so quickly, especially when it involves royalty. Especially when it involves power.
Supplier payments don't have to be hard. With World First, it's just 3 steps. Hold more than 20 currencies, convert.
Prince Harry may have just lost one of the last allies he thought he had. But this whole
not popularity.
It was also a promise Charles Spencer was Sussexes made a move
While Harry and
30 years after she
in headlines, William often remained focused on public duties.
that was quite bold and ambitious. But it had one catastrophic problem. They needed Charles Spencer to make it work. They wanted
Created a very different public image. One image focused on conflict, another image focused on continuity. And according to some analysts, audiences began noticing that contrast. At first, the difference didn't seem important. But over time, it became more noticeable. Then more noticeable. Then impossible to ignore. That's when some commentators started asking a question that would have sounded ridiculous just a few years ago. What if William's greatest advantage was simply saying less? It's a controversial theory, but it's one that has gained attention, because silence creates mystery, and mystery creates curiosity. People naturally want to know what isn't being said, what isn't being revealed, what remains hidden. That's human nature. The less information available, the harder people search for clues. And according to some royal watchers, that's exactly what happened. Every public appearance became analysed. Every interview became analysed. Every speech became analysed. People weren't just listening to what William said. They were paying attention to what he didn't say. That's where the speculation exploded. Because many commentators began interpreting William's silence as strategy. Not emotional strategy. Institutional strategy. The strategy of someone preparing for a future role. Again, nobody outside William's inner circle knows if that's true. But the perception itself became powerful. Powerful enough to influence the broader conversation. And once perceptions start changing, reactions follow. That's exactly what stunned many observers. Because public reactions started becoming less predictable. People who once supported Harry unconditionally began asking harder questions. People who once criticized William began reconsidering certain assumptions. People who had ignored royal news entirely suddenly became interested again. The audience was changing. The conversation was changing. The atmosphere was changing. And according to some commentators, change creates uncertainty. Uncertainty creates anxiety, especially for public figures. Because uncertainty is difficult to manage, you can't fight uncertainty directly. You can't issue a statement and eliminate it. You can't hold an interview and make it disappear. It lingers, growing quietly, expanding gradually, until eventually everyone feels it. That's where many analysts believe the current story sits. In a period of transition, not a conclusion, not a climax, a transition. The old narrative is weakening. The new narrative hasn't